Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Maureen O'Toole, retired out of the United States Army Reserves. I served for 26 years between active duty, National Guard, and the Army Reserves. But today I'm not going to tell my own story. I'm going to tell you the story of 6 amazing women who served in the Revolutionary War. Women whose actions were pivotal to the success of the Revolution, but whose names are rarely known by anybody. In 26 years of military service, I never heard a single one of these stories, so it is my honor to tell you these stories. I'm going to start with the power of the pen, the story of Catherine Mary Goddard. Catherine Mary Goddard's twin brother, William, apprenticed as a printer. And when he became the head of a magazine in Providence, Rhode Island, he took his sister and his mother, Sarah, into his work, and he ensured that they learned the trade itself, including the printing, collecting dues, journalism, and editing. And everywhere William went, he took his sister and his mother with him. So they learned the trade inside and out. So when he started the Baltimore Journal, he moved his mother and his sister with him. And when William was offered the opportunity to help start the first colonial postal system, he left his sister in charge, making her probably the first publisher of a journal in the United States. This was a very brave woman. In a time in which you did not want to print some stories about what was going on, out of fear of the British that they would take your assets, incarcerate you, and possibly hang you, she was one of the first people to publish the Declaration of Independence at the request of the Continental Congress. The original publication, only 2 of the members of Congress were willing to sign it. But she put her first 2 initials in her last name when she published it. She covered the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and she covered the activities of the Continental Congress. In 1777, when the Continental Congress wanted to republish the Constitution to show continued support for the war effort, they reached out to her specifically and asked her to publish it in its entirety, which she did. And this time, all of them signed it, and she signed her full name as well. Not only was she willing to take on a job that was in a man's world that could have led to her incarceration and the taking of her personal property, she also learned to be a bookbinder and owned a bookstore. And her story goes beyond that. At her death in 1816, her legacy continued when she freed her slave, Belinda, and gave her all of her assets. So the power of the pen led to the freedom of a slave many, many years before abolition. Now I'm going to move from the power of the pen to the power of the pincushion and tell you the story of one of the first couriers and spies that's recorded in colonial times as a woman. And this is Lydia Dara. Lydia Dara and her husband transplanted themselves from Ireland to Philadelphia. And in 1777, there were 23,000 colonists living in Philadelphia, but there were 14,000 quartered British troops. Their oldest son, Charles, enlisted under George Washington's army and was stationed 20 miles outside Philadelphia. As Lydia went through the town every day, she would overhear conversations. She would go home, tell her husband what he heard. He would then transcribe it onto small sheets of paper in a secret code that he created. She would then take the piece of paper, fold it into tiny, tiny little squares, bend it over the head of a button, and then put cloth over the button. She then sewed the button to a jacket, and her middle son, John, wore the jacket, walked 20 miles, and delivered to his brother, Charles. Charles would then take the buttons off, decode them, and give the intelligence to George Washington's staff. At one point in time, the British took over the largest room in their house. When the British were having an important meeting in her house one night, they asked all the family members to go to bed early. Lydia, however, slid into a closet in between the meeting room and the bedroom and stood all night long listening to the conversations. The next morning, she told her husband she was going to go out of town to buy flour and to go visit the children. She did not tell him the real purpose was to deliver the intelligence to George Washington's army, so he couldn't be complicit in her efforts. On her way to George Washington's camp, she encountered a friend of the family, Captain Craig, and she told him what she had learned about the troops and the weapons. It's not clear in history if she personally reported the information to George Washington's staff or if it was given by Captain Craig. But at any point, George Washington got the intelligence, and he was able to prepare his troops for a battle that was going to occur the next day. Lydia walked back home. The British were shocked when they arrived the next day and saw all the cannons facing them and the soldiers ready to charge. The British turned around and fled back to Philadelphia. When a British officer questioned Lydia as to whether or not people in her family had overheard the conversation last night, she answered no, because in truth, She was the only one who overheard the conversation. She is an amazing testament to creativity and to physical courage. So I've talked about someone used the power of the pen, someone used the power of a pincushion, and this is a woman of incredible bravery. This is a story of another Irish transplant who moved over here with her husband in 1865, the story of Elizabeth Hutchinson Jackson. She and her husband moved over here with their two sons, Hugh and Robert, because her sister had settled in South Carolina and said there was plenty of land and they should come farm. So they moved there. Unfortunately, 2 years later, her husband Andrew died very suddenly, leaving her with 2 boys and 3 days from giving birth to another son, who she named after her husband, Andrew. Her sister Jane, who had invited her to come over, invited her to come live with her family because Jane was ill at the time and had 4 boys. So Elizabeth packed up and moved onto the farm with her sister. Her sister died shortly after that, so now she raised 3 of her own boys and 4 of her sister's boys. At this point, the Revolutionary War was getting much closer to homesteads, and her oldest son enlisted in the militia of South Carolina. Unfortunately, he died in battle shortly after that in Charleston. As the battle got closer and closer to the homestead, the young lady, who now had 2 sons and was a widow and was raising 4 other boys, and her family began tending to the sick and the wounded that were close to them and going directly to the battlefields to care for them. Even as the battle got closer to Homestead, and this time they weren't just worried about British soldiers who were attacking farms and stealing and robbing and pillaging, but it was colonists who were loyal to the British who were doing the same thing to their neighbors. So her 2 sons joined an ad hoc militia and would ride through town at night on horses to protect people. One morning, the British broke into her house, and a British officer raised his saber and demanded that Andrew polish his boots. Andrew refused. British officer brought his saber down. Andrew put a hand up to stop it and received a large gash in his hand and a head wound. Another soldier attacked his brother, and his brother received a significant head wound. Despite serious injuries, the 2 boys were forced to walk 40 miles to a wet, cold jail. The British soldiers took most of their good clothing, their coats, and their shoes. They received very little food and very little medical care. Their mother heard about a program in which there was an exchange of British prisoners for American prisoners. So she went the 40 miles to broker the exchange. When she got there, both sons were suffering with malaria and smallpox. The British agreed to release both sons to her. Robert, however, was so ill that he had to be tied to the horse to make it home, and Andrew walked back the 40 miles. Robert died 2 days later. Elizabeth, undaunted, tended to her son until he was strong enough that she could leave him there, and returned with 2 other women 40 miles to try to get 2 of her nephews out of a British prison ship off the coast. While she was waiting for this to happen, she was caring for the sick, and she too contracted illness and died, leaving Andrew with no mother, no brothers, and in somebody else's house. But to his credit, he showed his mother's resilience and her courage, and he put himself through school and became a lawyer in Tennessee. He credited his mother for his tenacity, his honesty, his trustworthiness, and his unwillingness to stop doing what he needed to do. And he became the 6th president of the United States, President Andrew Jackson. Now I'm going to move on to the story of 2 sisters-in-laws who joined the effort themselves, not just with their hearts, but with their bodies and with rifles. This is the story of Grace and Rachel Martin. Grace and Rachel Martin married into the Martin family that had 7 sons. They married the oldest 2 of those sons. The mother was very pro the effort and told her sons, "Go, fight for your country, die if you must, but do not dishonor your country. Were I a man, I would go with you." And all 7 sons joined the effort. The girls moved in with Mrs. Martin and began homesteading. And at this time, the women were very important to the effort just by the fact that they were keeping people's businesses and ranches going and their farms going. But the violence on Loyalists versus the Tories continued to increase, and they were protecting themselves against colonists who were loyal to the British. The Martin family had already been attacked once, so the girls were on high alert. When they heard the story that a British courier was going to be passing through the local woods with top secret information, they decided to take matters into their own hands. The 2 girls put on their husbands' clothes, slung their rifles over their backs, put pistols in their pants pockets, and then laid in the woods waiting for the courier to come through with his 2 escorts. As the couriers came through close to dusk, the 2 girls jumped out and demanded the surrender of the 3 British soldiers. Surprisingly, they surrendered. The women demanded the secret information be handed over, and it was, and they asked the men to surrender in what was called at the time a parole. And if you signed this agreement, you were agreeing to no longer take up arms against the colonists nor recruit anybody else to the effort. And if you agreed to the agreement, then you could be let go on your own recognizance. The men turned their horses around and left. The women went back through the woods, back to the farm, put on their regular clothes, and began their regular life. Shortly after that, 3 people knocked on the door. And Elizabeth Martin, the mother of the boys, opened the door to find the 3 British officers who had just surrendered to the girls asking for lodging for the night. They agreed. And the next morning, the British officers left, slept, and fed, unaware that the people who had just given them breakfast were the same people who arrested them the night before. The women assured that the information was couried to the commander of the Continental Army and went on their way. Interestingly enough, the name Martin means warrior. So that fits not just the sons, but the mother and the 2 women. These 2 women are still celebrated in South Carolina history. I'm going to wrap this up with one of the women who is known to have dressed as a man and served in the Massachusetts militia. So there are at least 4 women who had dressed as men and fought in the war. This is the story of Deborah Sampson. Deborah Sampson was from a historic family. Her family had come over in previous generations on the Mayflower. When her father failed to come back from a voyage, her mother was forced to have the children go live with other people. And at the age of 10, Deborah became an indentured servant to Deacon Thomas, one of the neighbors. And she was self-educated. When she was emancipated from her indentured at 18, she became the village school teacher a couple months out of the year. And when she wasn't the village school teacher, she was a weaver. At this point in time, a lot of the conflict was between colonists who were either loyal to the revolution or loyal to the British. So when she decided to join the effort, she was fighting against the British. She dressed as a man and went to the recruiting office and signed in, took the money, and left and bought a dress. When she failed to show up for training, somebody recognized her handwriting as that of the headmistress, the schoolmistress. She returned most of the money except for what she used for a dress. A couple months later, undaunted, she walked to the next town, this time disguised herself as a man and gave her the name Robert Shurtiff and enlisted in the Massachusetts militia in the light infantry. She was credited, her and another soldier, with raiding a Tory home and taking 15 prisoners. Now, this story is very interesting because at this time in history, you shared a mat with another soldier. There were not cots like we have today in big tents. You slept wherever you could and you shared a mat. So how did she, for 18 months, keep her sex a secret? That is an amazing feat. In one conflict, she received a slash to the head from a saber, and she received at least 1 musket ball in her leg. There are alternating stories about whether she received 2. She was carried to the medical tent, and the surgeon did triage, treating the head wound and then moving on to other people to come back later. When he left the room, she grabbed a scalpel and dug the musket ball out of her leg. When she was unable to do that with the second one, she bandaged her leg and walked herself back to camp and continued to fight. Not too long after that, she became ill and was again carried to the medical tent, and this time the surgeon realized that this was a woman and sent her home because it was illegal for women to serve, so she could have been incarcerated and dishonorably discharged. However, General Washington showed compassion and she was honorably discharged. She did not return that we know of to being a school teacher. She married a farmer and had 3 children. But a local author, Herman Mann, was very interested in her story, as were other people, so he penned her biography. And then she started a 1-year traveling tour telling people about her history in the military, which makes her the first female traveling speaker. Interestingly enough, she petitioned for 10 years for back pay before the Massachusetts Commonwealth finally gave it to her. 19 years after the war was over, she was finally given a pension. And after her death at the age of 66, her husband petitioned for a spouse's pension, and it was received. To my knowledge, he is the only male spouse to have received a pension after the Revolutionary War. She suffered tremendously from the pain in her leg for the rest of her life, and her good friend, Paul Revere, petitioned on her behalf that she be given a larger pension, and it was approved. Her story goes beyond that. Go forward in time about 240 years. And in January 2021, our Congress enacted the Deborah Sampson Act. And the Deborah Sampson Act was created to create more equitable access to health care for women in the VA system. It also required the VA to create policies to prevent sexual harassment and assault on VA campuses. So her legacy moves forward in time and has affected thousands and thousands of women today. So that's the end of these stories. There are many, many more, but thank you for listening to these. It has been my honor to tell them.